Come, spellweavers, reavers, rogues, and men-at-arms, and answer the call of adventure. Pick up your sword, your axe, your spellbook, your bow, your rulebook, and your dice, and join the forces of good in their eternal fight against vile monsters, conspiring min-maxers, horny bards, and blood-soaked murder hobos. Discover the treasure trove of role-playing games here on Rollin Bones. My name is Ryan Howard, and I shall be your guide. Good evening, Boneheads, and welcome back to Rollin Bones with Ryan Howard, where we are making old school young again. I'm your host and king of the Boneheads, Ryan Howard. I am the R in OSR, and tonight is part 2, the second wave of the invasion from beyond Planet X. So Levi Combs will be back tonight, and we are talking all about the history of Arduin. Something that gamers of my generation probably aren't familiar with, but definitely an interesting chapter in role-playing history, and one that touches a lot of other historical figures and companies within the role-playing sphere. But before we do that, just want to remind everyone to like, share, and subscribe if you are enjoying what you're seeing from this and any other programming here at Rollin Bones. And you can find me in all the various social media down here at Twitter and Instagram. I am at Howard_Ryan Gregg, YouTube, Rollin Bones, and Twitch is twitch.tv/RollinBonesRyan. Twitter is where I'm most active right now. I'm doing daily threads 6 days a week on various topics within the role-playing world. So if you want to hear my thoughts on everything from the Dark Sun setting to actually mapping during your adventures to, various monsters, classes, all that kind of stuff, you can find that over on my Twitter page. And of course, I want to remind everyone of the TeePublic store, the Bonehead Emporium, where you can get such great designs as the Bonehead t-shirt, the RPG Gorillas unit patch t-shirt, and of course the main logo t-shirt. Levi just recently picked up a hoodie, which he is showing off right now. I will bring him on and you guys will be able to see it. But yeah, this, you can get Rollin Bones swag over on TeePublic. So without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, let's bring on tonight's guest. He is the elder brain that runs Planet X Games. He is one of the greatest role-playing minds in the world right now. He's a great OSR creator. Ladies and gentlemen, Levi Combs.
Hey, there we go. Hey, this is a really nice hoodie, by the way. Look at that zipper. Heavy, charcoal gray.
Nice.
2X. Right at my alley. And I don't know what you're smoking about greatest role-playing minds, but that is a very nice thing to say. Not true, but very nice. So I appreciate that.
I think it's true.
Good Lord, no.
I've told multiple people at this point, but when you and I connected, I did not know anything about the OSR. Nothing. I was purely in the 5e world, and I heard you on Vintage RPG. That was my first exposure to you. But you were the one who kind of brought me into the OSR world. And so when I tell people that, I also say it's kind of like learning to drink with absinthe. But
all right, fair comparison.
You really are, you were the first person to kind of bring me into this OSR world when you got me hooked up with the frogs and everyone that has been on because you were on first. So I owe you a debt of gratitude. And also, I think you are one of the greatest minds in the OSR right now. So,
no, man, listen, you give all of us a platform to talk about our stuff and to try to get word out about things that we're doing and just have good conversations. So that goes both ways. So, no worries on that.
And,
unless you're this dude.
And Scott from Orcus Dorcas, we definitely need to get you a 5-Timers Club jacket. I have seen that skit, Scott. I know what you're talking about.
It's me and Steve Martin and Alec Baldwin.
Yep. I think Paul Simon was in there too.
Yeah. Tom Hanks.
Yep.
Justin Timberlake. That's right. Yeah, yeah.
Some other people that will end up on that list sooner rather than later. I think Ian and Rocky will end up on there. Luau Lu gonna end up on there.
I love those guys. Yeah, I just did an adventure with Luau Lu. Like we just just wrote it. He wrote the majority of it, actually. It was, I had a very loose outline, but then, like anything, that guy is just, he's a killer. He's just like, hey, here's a paragraph outline. And he comes back with like 17,000 words. Like he's just a machine, and a good one. So, yeah. And then Ian and Rocky, just fantastic people.
Absolutely.
I love those dudes.
So the topic of tonight's show is Arduin.
Yeah.
And you've been geeked to talk about this one for a long time. You're probably the biggest Arduin fan I know.
Man, I love Arduin. Yeah. I'm not. I don't go as far as call myself a super fan, but like I really, really like it.
And again, just to kind of remind everyone of my roots here, I wasn't playing role-playing games until 2014, 2015. So this is well before my time, both chronologically and in terms of role-playing. But Arduin pops up not too terribly long right after D&D is released. It spins out of David Hargrave's house rules for Dungeons and Dragons, and it kind of emerges as an early, almost competitor to D&D. So let's kind of begin at the inception of Arduin. So where does the story of Arduin begin for you as a fan? And then let's get into the history.
Well, first, I'm no Arduin scholar. Like
Okay.
I'm not. That's I'm not. I can't tell you what Dave Hargrave was having for dinner in February of 1979. I don't but I don't get that deep into it. But I am a fan, like a big fan, and I have followed it literally since finding it all those years ago in a stack of books. But if you really wanted to talk, like get down like the deep minutia of the history of that, you'd have to talk to somebody like Andy Markham, who really is a super fan. He knows all about it. He runs the Arduin Facebook group.
Gotcha.
And then John Peterson, of course, or Dave and George from Emperor's Choice. They would be good. Mike Gunderloy, Joseph Block could probably do it. But again, I'm not that guy. But I can, with enthusiasm and a love of its creative abandon, we can have a conversation. So where do I? Sorry, go ahead.
I was just gonna say, like, where did you first encounter Arduin, and what gave you the Arduin bug, so to speak?
So we've talked about it before on this show, but I had a really kind of weird entry into the hobby. As far as like how I got started. I got a red box that had no dice in it, and like a couple months later, ended up getting a monster manual at a yard sale. So I was trying to put those two together and figure out what I didn't know the difference between basic D&D and advanced Dungeons and Dragons. I lived in a very small town. There wasn't anybody playing Dungeons and Dragons, so it's just kind of by pure chance that I found it all. But a family had moved into our small little town in Arkansas, and the dad in the family, he had been in the Air Force, so he had traveled around and he had played D&D in the Air Force quite a bit, and he had three sons that were around my age. One of them was older, one of them was a little younger, one was right my age. So he started up a campaign for us, because we were all kind of theater kids and running wild in the summer and whatnot. So in an effort to kind of like settle us down, I think maybe he started running D&D games. and it was, it was just basic AD&D. But he had, all the books, the all the core books and the deities and demigods and the fiend folio. And we would look at the pictures and we would, try to figure stuff out. But he had all this extra stuff too that didn't really make any sense. It wasn't Dungeons and Dragons stuff, but it was kind of like it. And it was like the old Dragon Tree Press stuff, like the Book of Plots and the Book of Spells, all this stuff. And we would go through those and read them and just kind of, would fire our imaginations. But the thing that caught my attention the most were these 3 little brown books that he had. And those were the Arduin trilogy, the first 3 books. It was Arduin Grimoire, Welcome to Skull Tower, and Runes of Doom. Those are the first 3 Arduin books. And when you go back and look at those, like, they don't make much sense. Like, it's kind of a mishmash of rules. Like, one page is, they're talking all about, like, I don't know, technos and slavers and witch hunters. And you're like, what is this? And then there's like, a section on prismatic walls. And then, you're, huh? And then there's a whole like brutal critical hit system. And then there's a fumble chart. And then they go like right into like, here's 21 levels of hell. Like it's all over the place and has no kind of rhyme or reason to it. But that's part of its charm, because these books are just packed. And I mean, packed full of ideas and cool little hooks and things that will just fire your imagination. So I was reading, nobody else was reading those in our little group, but I was just devouring those and making little notes. And they really captivated me in a way that was equal to, or maybe even more so than the course, the core books. I got just as much of a charge out of reading those little books and looking at the weird little illustrations by Errol Otis and Morneau and all these different artists that I did, reading the core stuff.
Yeah, it's interesting seeing kind of the limited exposure that I've had to Arduin. You mentioned Morrow. Seeing Morrow's art, it's
Morneau.
very...
I forget his actual name, but his pen name on his art was Morneau with an N.
Yep. Seeing Morneau's art.
Sorry.
And
I didn't want the Arduin fans to roast you.
I finished this right before the show, so
cheers.
We can blame it on the bourbon. Morneau, seeing some of the art that you've posted on Instagram and in anticipation of tonight's episode, looking at it versus some of the other art that you see around that time, specifically I'm thinking of like the first Greyhawk supplement and that really unfortunate looking beholder on the cover. Morneau's work really seems to be like almost a decade ahead of everyone else at this point, just kind of based on the amount of detail that he's able to render in his drawings.
Yeah, I now forgive me. I wrote it down here somewhere, but I forgot his real name. His pen name was just Morneau.
Yeah.
But yeah, he went on to actually produce some really cool stuff. I think he did last thing that I saw was he did this really cool fantasy calendar that was stunning. We're talking like his art looked that good in the 70s. You see it like in the early to mid 2000s, and it's just like your eyes are popping out of your head. It's so good. Like if he wanted to ever like go commercial and be that guy, I mean, he'd be huge. But you also had Errol Otis, like a young Errol Otis is doing work for Arduin. like it's just such a crazy crossover between the two, because at that time he had done his own stuff too, and he did work for Dungeons and Dragons, and to have him in kind of both scenes at the same time is nuts. And even going back then and looking at his art back in those the old I think it was in he did art for a couple of the modules, at least one, Howling Tower, Caliban, or one of those, and then of course the Arduin Grimoire. Like, it's all great. It's all really, really good work. Like, even for a young, like, just getting a start Errol Otis, he's still Errol Otis. You can still tell he's gonna be a somebody.
Oh yeah. Yeah, it's hard to mistake just that very specific, very singular Errol Otis kind of
Yeah. Yeah. I
melty
mean,
style that he's known for.
the greats are great for a reason, and you could tell
Mm,
even then that he was going to be, a master. So
gotcha.
he's like Trampier in that way, like a lot of those early guys, like their work is just so far. It defined the way that we see D&D. Like I can't look at a lich, a picture of a lich, without thinking of Trampier's lich. I can't look at a Froghemoth without thinking of Errol Otis's Froghemoth. Like
Mm,
the stuff they did in those early days, it defines how we see D&D now, because everything is extrapolated from that. I mean, they're they are the co-authors of our imagination. you
yep.
know
Yeah, absolutely. Now, something interesting about Arduin, just kind of in its early days, uh, Hargrave is from the Bay Area, so
Yeah.
he's interacting with kind of the San Francisco sect of who would eventually kind of become that school of designers, including one Greg Stafford, who was
Chaosium, yeah.
originally going to publish Arduin through Chaosium.
Yes. That was a bit of a falling out.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the way it's been explained to me, obviously I wasn't in the scene back then. The way it's been explained to me is that there was the Midwest kind of movement for D&D, kind of the heartland. The the people who, this is where role playing started. It's the birthplace.
Yep.
Gary and all those folks. It was the source code, and then you had the guys out in California, basically the West Coast guys, and they had it too, but they were doing something different. Had kind of a wilder sort of, genre bashing sort of
Mhm.
approach to it all. And Hargrave was kind of at the forefront of that. Like he was the
Yep.
first guy who says, you know what, why can't we have cowboys and ninjas and, I don't know, saints and technos, and why can't we have laser guns? This is long before Barrier Peaks comes along. You get Arduin, it has all this stuff
Mhm.
in it. So it's really the first of the genre, kind of the genre bashing, cross genre games.
Yep.
But going back to Stafford, now Stafford was if I'm recalling correctly, was a member of Dave Hargrave's like home group, like was
Yep.
just or at least played with him maybe at one of the shops or maybe one of the Dungeon or something. But they knew each other, and Stafford played with Hargrave and loved his stuff. Like thought like, oh, because the word always was that like Hargrave was like a fantastic DM,
Mm.
but was just kind of like a little abrasive. He could
Yep.
be hard to get along with, or he might take a little. That was the word. I'm not
Mhm.
saying that's necessarily the truth, but that was what I always heard. And of course, this is years later that I'm hearing it, so who knows? Um, but yes, Chaos. So Stafford wanted to publish Arduin through Chaosium, but then then Hargrave turns in kind of like a unfinished sort of mishmashy, kind of what the first Arduin Grimoire is just kind of just a collection of not even articles, just like a little
Mhm.
bit of this, a little bit of that, throw it together. And Stafford's like, I can't publish this, man. Like, this isn't really a game.
Mhm.
Um, this is unpublishable, basically.
Yep.
So Hargrave, so he says, I can't do it. So Hargrave takes that to heart and severs the relationship with Stafford, apparently.
Mhm.
Um, again, and he took a jab at Stafford later on because I don't remember if it's in um, the Skull Tower or Runes of Doom, but there's a spell called it's like Stafford's Starbridge, maybe.
Mhm.
Where this is really kind of petty. So it's about like how you can you make this like cool bridge of stars that can span anything, but then you can make the bridge to like where people will fall. If you don't want somebody to cross it, they'll fall through. It's just like,
Oh man.
come on, man, that's super super duper petty.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, he put Stafford's name on it. I think it's Starbridge, but Stafford's Starbridge. Yeah.
Mhm. Man, that's like funky Flashman petty.
Yes. Oh man, that's a deep cut right there.
For anyone who doesn't know what I'm talking about, one of the characters in Jack Kirby's Fourth World is the funky Flashman. And for anyone unfamiliar with the history of Fourth World, Kirby created it while at Marvel, wanted it to be kind of like his own little universe there. Marvel said no, so he left. He took it to DC, and DC accepted, the biggest name from Marvel Comics as far as artists
Yeah.
were concerned with open arms. And he creates the Fourth World, and Orion and Darkseid and Calabac and all those cool characters. But along with them is this character named the Funky Flashman, who is very much directly one-to-one Stan Lee from the 70s.
Very much so.
And he also, at the end of every day, takes off his sunglasses, his fake hair, and his fake beard and puts them on a mannequin head. So, yeah. We're dealing with that level of pettiness.
Yeah, super, super duper petty. But you look back, looking back and now Jack did have a point. So
yeah, fair enough.
that we could fill a whole podcast with that discussion. But moving along.
Yeah, but it really is interesting how again, Chaosium is about to kind of like take off at this point, and so these two kind of intersect with each other right as Chaosium is about to become a thing as well, and also enter the fray as an early competitor to Dungeons and Dragons. But it's interesting to me how many of these kind of pioneers of role playing were not very good at actually publishing legible books in a lot of ways. Like, people talk about Gygax being difficult to read. There's a method to the Gygax madness, and he was one of the better ones about actually being able to organize his thoughts into a book that's readable and coherent.
Oh, listen, man, you can take the worst Gygax prose ever. Okay, take the worst, which I still don't think is that bad.
Right.
You take the worst because it's Gygaxian. It has its own genre, but you imagine his worst prose. It is still light years beyond the mishmash. Absolute insanity of the first little Arduin book. And that's, again, making a point off that. Like, I don't think that's even Arduin's. Arduin's strength is not like in rules or like having a coherent game. In fact, it's just, this is just my opinion. I don't even think that is even the drawing point to Arduin. Like, I don't think that's what's cool about it at all. The rules, to me, are entirely secondary. It's the lore, and it's the again, that creative abandon and like pure style, and like Hargrave's enthusiasm for just his love of gaming comes through in what he writes. And those first three books, man, you put those together, and it's a jumping point for 1,000 adventures just jammed into those books. Like, there's so much cool stuff in those books, whether it's new monsters, locations, NPCs, new spells, magic items, his own world. He does a whole timeline for a world we don't even know about, but he seeds it with all these cool little events and cool little things that just makes your brain just start firing off in these random directions, so that you're coming up with all these cool ideas of your own. That's the genius of Arduin, in my opinion. It's not the rules or like the layout or even the art. Like, it's that enthusiasm, that creative abandon.
But like, a lot of people wonder why once D&D was kind of out, you don't really hear from Dave Arneson anymore. Dave Arneson had a similar problem where he just straight up could not write coherently.
Well, it happens to everybody. I mean, we've all had a writer's block, or been stuck. Everybody has their own ways around it, but can't blame the man.
Now, the lore of Arduin you mentioned it's very interesting. I mean, we're dealing with, like you said, this kind of genre bending world, but you're also dealing with a world that's situated in what's essentially a Cold War, like a
Yeah.
Cold War scenario when you start off, and obviously it's the 70s, so the Cold War itself is it's everyone knows about it at that point. It's not a secret. That's the stupidest thing anyone's ever said about the Cold War. But it's always interesting to place gamers in a scenario where you are sitting directly between two factions that have fought each other before and will likely fight each other again. And that's kind of where Arduin starts you out, I guess.
Are you talking about like the humanity and kind of the lands
Yep.
of men versus the titans and star powered mages?
Yes.
Okay, yeah, that's a thing. Like, so for people who are listening that aren't familiar with Arduin, he's right. It is kind of a Cold War, and you're kind of coming in after the way that it starts out, at least in the first three books, is there was these horrible wars, and these beings called star powered mages, which are basically like super magic users, super wizards, and they have this little gem in their foreheads that channels energy from the stars, and they've teamed up with titans, like titans, how you would think of them in D&D, even almost more godlike than that. And they've teamed up with them to kind of overthrow or just rule the world. And humanity, elves, dwarves, everyone rises up against them. And there's kind of a standoff to where the star-powered mages and the titans depart for the stars, and you never know if they're going to come back or if there's outposts left behind or any of that kind of stuff. At least that's how I always took it from reading the history and the timeline. Other people may have different ideas of how all that went down. Like certainly Dave and George from Emperor's Choice might have a different idea of that, and guys who have played Arduin or been immersed in the world for a long time. But that's how I always took it. But yeah, I never even really thought about that time and there being a Cold War connection. But that's again very apt. Like last week when we were talking about the grindhouse influences, on pop culture, like you're in it. You're thinking about this stuff way deep.
Well, and Hargrave, you have to take into account Hargrave is in the Bay Area in '76, so the withdrawal from Vietnam is right there, like right on it's on the precipice of happening, right as kind of Arduin is forming. So
he's a vet himself. So
yeah, you have this kind of theme happening in history of an empire withdrawing from somewhere, and obviously you have the bigger Cold War as well, but I mean, he's all wrapped up in the counterculture and kind of the capital of the counterculture at that point. So,
yeah, he's right down there, like in the Berkeley area. So, absolutely.
And it looks like Shadow and Sun is here, and he is predicting. So he was on the phone with George this weekend that Arduin is going to make a huge comeback. So,
I'm here for it.
Absolutely, absolutely. Now, when it comes to, again, things in Arduin, ideas presented in Arduin, what would you say are kind of the like big ideas or things presented in Arduin that had kind of like a massive impact on the way role-playing games have evolved since then?
Well, I don't know about massive impact on the way things are now. I mean, certainly there is like a legacy. There are certainly things that stood out.
Yeah.
And there are certainly things that I don't know, like again, there's a legacy of that. The genre bashing, especially, like since it was the first game that really just said, hey, it's a stew pot, throw it in here if it works. That has certainly trickled down to today. I don't know if that Arduin is necessarily the genesis for that. I think that would have happened regardless over time, but they were certainly the first to do it. Their strength, again, like I was talking about before, is the strength is in the lore, is in the enthusiasm, is in the world building. You see a lot of that today because we have role-playing games that are system neutral, that are just sometimes settings get put out and then there's not even any rules attached to them. So that would definitely be a legacy. For sure, like Planescape, I don't know would even exist without Arduin. You think Planescape is this setting? You're in Sigil, the city of doors, and there are gates everywhere. Well, Arduin was a whole world that was just riddled with gates and portals to all kinds of different places. I mean, there was a multiversal trading company that was situated around, bringing in goods from all over the cosmos or the universe. Dark Sun, for instance, has the Thri-kreen.
Yep.
And we've seen Thri-kreen before Dark Sun, but the Thri-kreen is essentially just the Fraint from Arduin. And that was a playable race back in 77. Or I guess 78. So I mean, would you have the Thri-kreen in Dark Sun without the Fraint first in Arduin? Probably not. That's debatable, but I'd like to think not. So yeah, there's a lot of trickle down from Arduin. Again, that genre bashing being the main one.
Yeah, Shadow and Sun calls out the plateau forever, where all the dimensions meet. I get kind of being pretty similar to Sigil in that regard.
Yeah, absolutely,
and definitely, I'm sure if next week if I tackled Zeb Cook and didn't get kicked out of North Texas for doing that, and was like, is Sigil the plateau of forever? He'd probably be like, yes, it is. Now get off of me.
Strangely enough, at GameholeCon this last year, I did ask him this question because being such a huge Arduin fan, I had just a moment, a couple minutes there to talk to him. I said, Zeb, I got to ask you. I got to know. And so I did pose that question to him. And he had kind of a whole different genesis for Planescape that didn't involve Arduin. That was surprising, but also made a whole lot of sense. But it's hard for me to imagine, like, without that existing and at least being in the thought sphere of things, that some of that didn't cross over at some point. Like, it's just too similar, and it did come first in a long time. It was in the mix for a very long time, decades before we had Planescape. So. Like, you at least got to think that there's some cross pollination or a little bit of that leaked in a little bit of this, and you get Planescape.
Yep. So, I mean, we've talked a lot about the early part of Arduin, but I guess like moving out of the 70s into the early 80s, what happens with Arduin as far as keeping up with D&D? Because at a certain point D&D becomes a runaway train, and they're the market leader, but Arduin is still around to some extent at that point. What happens to Arduin once the gaming boom really kind of comes into effect in 1980, 1981?
Yes, especially in the early 80s. It gets sold to Grimoire Games, which is Jim Mathis, I think. He puts out, Lost Grimoire, he puts out Dark Dreams, House of the Rising Sun. He several books there that all build on Hargrave's original 3 books. But the big thing that happens is the lawsuit. And that actually kind of happens before the 80s. That's if I'm remembering correctly. Again, I'm not a scholar, but you can't talk about the history of Arduin without talking about the lawsuit from TSR, like the threat of the lawsuit from TSR, because it is so funny, like the way that it all kind of went down, because nobody can really look at Arduin objectively and say that, like, at least in the early days, that it is not, a work of plagiarism of some level, like you can't look at it and say that. Yes, there are all kinds of new elements, but I mean, like the prismatic wall or prismatic sphere, one of those prismatic spells is literally lifted right out of the player's handbook. The if I'm remembering correctly, in the early days of D&D, there was a misprint that said, instead of in the monster entry, it would say percentage lair. It was supposed to say percentage lair. You know, the percentage of the monster that you were encountering was actually in its lair.
Mm-hmm.
But there was a misprint that said percentage liar, as in, and people reading it, if they didn't read between the lines, took that, well, this is the percentage that the monster is going to tell me a lie or is going to mislead me, which Hargrave did do. So in his original Arduin books, he in the monster entries, he includes percentage liar in there, so you can look at it. He reprinted a misprint, so there's a lot of things like that that kind of, you can tell that they're really crossing the streams, and he's really borrowing hard. Plus, Arduin is not, at this point, is not even really a game, not really, without having a Dungeons and Dragons. You have to have it, so you got like Gary Gygax is taking pot shots at Dave in Dragon, and rightfully so. Like, he had honestly, he had a IP to protect. This was his work. So he was taking pot shots at Hargrave. He even in the first edition, and it probably goes back farther, but I remember seeing it for the first time in the first edition Dungeon Master's Guide. There's a magic item called the Vacuous Grimoire, which is a stab at the Arduin Grimoire. And if you pick it up and read it, like, you lose I think it's like -1 intelligence, -2 wisdom. It's a cursed book that this grimoire you pick up. So that's a bit of a stab, at Hargrave. And Gary went at him about spell points and critical hits, because Hargrave had I think it's brilliant. It's super deadly. But he had a great critical hit and fumble system. I mean, it gets a little ridiculous in places, but like, it really ups the ante for rolling a 1 or a 20. My old DM in my original AD&D group we played AD&D rules, but we used Hargrave's critical hit system, and you just never knew what was going to happen. It's kind of like the Mighty Deeds and the unpredictability of DCC now. Arduin had that with the critical hit and fumble system.
Yep.
But so much more deadly, because you might be first level and you roll a 20, right? And you're facing off against, like, I don't know, a third level monster, and you roll 99 on the die, and like, you just beheaded. Like, it doesn't matter how many hit points you have. But they could do that to you too. So it could be a hobgoblin facing off against a 12th level fighter. When he rolls a 20, when he rolls, double odd on the dice, and all of a sudden he stabs you through the heart and you're dead. It doesn't matter how many hit points you have. So a high level of lethality, high level of chance. 1 in 20 rolls, something crazy is going to happen. So you had a lot of that.
Yep. Shadow and Sun does point out here, apparently by volume 3, Hargrave had kind of separated out the rules of the rules of what Arduin is versus D&D. But I think Shadow, what Levi was getting at there was, because Arduin is born out of essentially house rules for D&D, there is a little bit of a debt owed to D&D in that regard, that it takes the playing in the rule system of D&D to create Arduin, and then Arduin differentiated itself. But I see your point there, Shadow. And
it definitely becomes its own game after the third. He makes great, because I think that's when complete Arduin, or at least the basis for what becomes complete Arduin, comes to the fore.
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
And then he also points out that nowadays there are so many systems, including DCC, like you mentioned, that use spell points and crit and fumble tables and stuff like that. So
sure.
Yeah, definitely.
Great points.
Yeah, definitely. The critical fumbles, especially, are something that I think are pretty fun. So
Yeah, it's not so when you go back and look at like the Arduin fumble tables, it's not just I missed or I threw my sword or oh I don't know, I gave myself a -2 to hit. Like
mhm.
it gets pretty dicey. Like you can kill yourself with your own
Yeah.
sword at times. Like but I think all that's just I think that's cool. Like
Mhm.
I like that about it. Like I'm not ragging on it at all. Like I think it's cool.
Mhm. So Grimoire Games holds on to Arduin, I guess, through the 80s, and like you said, there's legal troubles for Arduin kind of in this period, and unfortunately, as people have been pointing out in the chat, Hargrave does not live to see the end of the 80s.
Yeah.
Hargrave passes away tragically early in 1988.
Yeah.
So I like
Yeah.
from there on, Arduin continues without its creator, essentially.
Yeah, and I think up until his death, I want to say, didn't Dragon Tree Press? Wasn't he? Didn't he have a piece of that, or
I
wasn't he
think so.
publishing through Dragon Tree Press at that time?
Mhm.
I'm not sure if he was publishing through there, or that maybe they had some sort of like subsidiary rights or something. But
Yep.
I know Dragon Tree Press was putting out some stuff for Arduin as well. I'm not
Mhm.
sure of again, you'd have to talk to maybe the guy in the chat. Maybe
Yep.
he might know, but you'd have to talk to somebody like Andy Markham or again John Peterson, one of those guys. They would probably know better than I as far as like who had the rights at what time and whatnot. So, but I want to say Dragon Tree Press had a piece of that for at least a minute, at least for a couple years.
Mhm. Yeah, it looks like mid 80s up through Hargrave's death, Dragon Tree Press is publishing.
Mm.
It looks like the Grimoire Association ends around 1983. Dragon Tree Press picks up through Hargrave's death, and then it goes back to Grimoire for a little
Yeah, I
bit.
want to say like it's 88 ish when Winds of Chance comes out, and that's like the last it's the last book for a while until End War with
Yep.
Emperor's Choice. Yeah, I think Winds of Chance is the last of the little brown booklets at that time. Again, I could be wrong, but that's like the 8th book, I want to
Mhm.
say. And we of course we get ninth with End of War.
Yep.
That's early 2000s. So
Mhm. And as Shadow points out, I'll put it back up here again. Um, Hargrave dies during the writing of Book 8. So Book 8 and then pretty much all of Book 9 are posthumous. So
right. But I don't think book 9 comes out until Emperor's Choice gets a hold of the license,
yeah,
right?
yeah,
Like I want to say, yeah,
yeah. Based on the timeline I'm seeing here, then yeah.
yeah. Because the End War that I have is made by Emperor's Choice. So
Hmm. But I mean, like at this point, like, we have a product with Arduin that has carried through the very early days of role playing up until the 90s. Uh, the RPG market has changed several times over in this period. So I, when it comes to stuff that's being released in the early 80s, the late 80s, and then into the early 90s, when things really change with like second edition really taking off, and Vampire being as big a deal as it is, does Arduin adapt at all, or does Arduin continue just kind of being its own unique thing through all of this?
well, in the 90s, like let's say like 92, 93, you've got Vampire. Like
Yeah.
that's all that stuff starting to come out to the to the fore. You got D&D going strong with second edition. You got other games that are coming out. And sadly, I think 92, I want to say, is still Jim Mathis, is like the end of the Grimoire Games era, I want to say. Again, it could be wrong, but no, those in the 90s, those especially the early 90s, it was outdated. It
Mhm.
was kind of an ineffectual system. Again, Arduin purists probably hate me for saying that, but I feel that that's the truth. Again, the rules were never the strength of Arduin. Again, that's my opinion. Please don't roast me or hang me on my words. But like, it doesn't grow with the hobby really. It's still kind of stuck in that kind of back, because Arduin is never like OSR. Like, people like to say that Arduin is it's the OSR, but it's not. Like, they were always one of its, again, the strength of it, that it was bucking the system, and it was trying out new things, and it was from a very early time was already deviating from what we think of as the old school Renaissance, or the old school. So I don't really consider it's certainly an old school feel game where it feels like the days of yore of gaming, but it really is its own thing. You know what I mean? Like, once it sheds its kind of D&D-ish, where it's literally just D&D under a different name. Once it sheds that and becomes its own game, it's a whole different ball game. Arduin is a whole game that is off to the races on its own.
Yeah.
But in 92, 93, it just wasn't there. Not yet. It would take it would be until Emperor's Choice got a hold of it and started doing some different things with it before it really started feeling like like for me at least, like a cohesive game that you could actually play. Like early Arduin, even like Arduin in the 80s, and it's still not a great game. It wasn't until Emperor's Choice gets a hold of it that it becomes better. That's just my opinion.
Yeah, and that's what's interesting.
From a guy who loves Arduin. Don't get me wrong. I'm a super fan, dude. I love Arduin. But again, back then, during this time frame, the rules are not the strength.
Yeah, it sounds like even Shadow in chat would agree with you on that. But what's interesting about this, just kind of, again, from my outsider's perspective on the role-playing culture of the 90s, there's not this sense of historical preservation that there is now, where people nowadays, especially since the OSR movement really came about, we want to preserve these old systems, and we want to play the games the way they were originally played. We want these old rules to survive, and we want to run games using these old rule systems. My reading on the 90s was that was very much passé. Like, if you were still running OD&D or Arduin, or even like first edition AD&D, you were somewhat of a dinosaur to a lot of people.
I think that it is entirely subjective to whatever circle that you ran in. I know there are guys who claim to still be playing chainmail. They're still playing their their basic games or first edition games. I know these days I like to play games that are simpler. So I get it. But at least in my experience, in my game group, we just played whatever was whatever the newest version of D&D was, which was at this time at least was second edition. So we played a ton of second edition. We devoured second edition resources, and this is right on the right when the internet was starting to get in people's homes, and like everyone had it, kind of it was starting to pop up. By 96, my parents had a computer in their house. It was like a big deal. So you started building these little communities. But yeah, for my experience, it was second edition D&D is what we played, and then we would just discover new games all the time, but we would try them out. But at least our game group was devouring really whatever we could get our hands on. We come from a small town, so we would go out of town to like a place like Little Rock that actually had a game store. So we would go and buy as many games as we'd buy Champions and Cyberpunk and Chill and all these games, and we would bring them back, and we would try to play them and see which ones we liked and which ones we didn't. That's how it rolled for us. So we were always looking for the next new big thing. It wasn't until really with the OSR movement, that old school Renaissance and OSRIC and all that stuff, that where the OSR is kind of reborn, and we a large movement going back towards those kind of games. People who never even played them are going back now and playing them for the first time. So, yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, you mentioned Osric. Most people consider, 2006 Osric to be kind of the genesis of the OSR movement. But right
Yeah.
around that same time, I mean, obviously there was a movement before that on forums.
Sure.
This is where stuff like, Frog God comes from, and where Matt Finch kind of first gets active and leading up to Osric and the birth of the OSR. But right around that same time is when um, Arduin is picked up by Emperor's Choice. So
Yeah.
it's very shortly before this that Emperor's Choice gets a hold of Arduin. And again, from what you have said and from what Shadow is saying here in chat, it sounds like that's the point where things kind of turn around for Arduin.
Yeah. So the thing about Emperor's Choice, the thing I like best about them, and I know those dudes, they're real nice guys, is that they genuinely love Arduin. Like, they didn't buy it because they wanted to turn around and make a quick buck. They didn't want to take it and make it something else. They love Arduin. Like, they love it for all the great things about it, and they love it for its imperfections. They are very good stewards of the property. They, in the fact that they really love it. They are true fans of Arduin, and it's just good to see like such a beloved property like that land in the hand of people who just want to see it done good, So yeah, those guys, they're not just creators and publishers, but they're fans. And I think that's a very important distinction to make about Emperor's Choice.
Gotcha. Now, they kind of, I guess, enter the scene with Volume 9 of Arduin Grimoire. And so I have to ask, with David Hargrave being, dead for 10 plus years at that point, is there Hargrave material in that 9th book, or is it just kind of a spiritual continuation of Arduin at that point?
I'm not sure. That's I'll have to ask those guys about that. I would imagine so, and here's why I say that. I know that there's stuff in there that's written by other people. However, I know that when they bought the property, they got a ton of Dave's, I guess probably all of his old notes. They got all of his old dungeons. They got all of his old maps. They got tons of like little cards with items written on them. All this stuff. So when they bought the property, they get this mountain of cool stuff. That's totally unpublished and completely nobody's ever seen before.
Gotcha.
And Hargrave had done he had done some like Arduin stuff for friends or like for people in his game group that it still survives to this day. Some of it's unpublished. Or has people have just posted scans online or shared in Facebook groups and stuff. But it's all like, if you're a fan of Arduin, it's all pretty compelling, because if you're a fan of that material already. But I would guess that there's some Hargrave stuff in War without popping it out now and looking in the credits. I don't know. I can't answer that reliably. But if I had to guess, I would say yes. He says it's all Hargrave.
Yeah. Shadow says,
excellent.
And I guess, and again, this is just kind of me extrapolating from what you and Shadow have said, but it sounds to me almost like what they're doing now is what, there are several authors and historians that people have done this with, but Murray Rothbard is kind of the first example that comes to mind for me. He died in the 90s, but people are still releasing Murray Rothbard books because they have his notes and have been able to, they actually had to bring in like handwriting experts to figure out what he had written, but they're able to extrapolate like manuscripts for whole books from notes that Murray Rothbard left behind when he passed away. So it sounds like they're doing much the same thing for for David Hargrave here with the Arduin stuff that was unpublished.
Well, I know the project that I worked on with them. It was, hey, here's an original Hargrave map.
Mm-hmm.
Take that. Here's some notes. Take that and extrapolate off of it. So I would say that's very, very accurate. That's the same thing they did with like Dune, all the Dune stuff. Like they had all of Herbert's notes and it's like copious notes. And then they bring in his son. They're like, hey, here's the timeline. Here's all the bits. Can you put it together and make it coherent and make it a readable book? And I mean, if I remember correctly, he did. He had like books and books and on top of books. There were quite a few of them actually. So, all that makes sense. I didn't know. I thought that when I was looking through the ninth, the End War, the last of the books, I could have swore that there were some other people writing on that, but I may be thinking of something else. So I'm glad that that was brought up in the chat. Again, I'm no expert. I'm just a big fan.
And again, like as far as the credits go on those books, it might be them crediting people who have helped them compile notes and things like that into something readable, something that people can actually reference as kind of a rule or a setting book. So that could be the case there, as far as like other people's name being credited alongside Hargrave. But that's
that all tracks for sure.
But no, I mean, Shadow is saying that 2024 is going to be a huge year for Arduin. So I
hope so. I'm here for it, man.
I have very limited exposure to it, so we might have to do a follow-up. And what we might have to do if we follow up on this is bring Shadow on and talk about it.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Or Dave and George as well. Like bring those guys on, man. Again, they're very good stewards for the property because they love it so much. Yep. You know what I mean? Like, they're fans. Like, they want to see it done right. Which is very heartening. They're not looking for a quick buck. They're not just putting out a big flashy book that will have no substance and will be all style. They're genuinely looking to do good things.
Yep, absolutely. Now I'm gonna start this next question by putting up this message that I starred here earlier, where Rex Teal says it's better as a source book for other fantasy RPGs. What do you think kind of the ultimate legacy of Arduin is? Do you think that it's become something that DMs can reference just to add some weirdness or add some kind of interesting flavor to their campaigns? Is that kind of where you see Arduin's influence as it stands today?
Well, there's a couple layers to that question. There's like what does Arduin mean to me? Like, how do I use it? How do I think that the public will use it? And how do I think that it will be used in the future? So how I think it'll be used in the future, it will be used as its own system because the guys at Emperor's Choice they're working very hard to make it its own. But it is its own, but to make it a better coherent system, to make it all come together and be super playable and accessible. You know what I mean? So in the future, it will definitely where it stands now. I think there's not a ton of Arduin groups out there playing. There are certainly some, but like, are there a lot of? Is there a big community of people who are playing Arduin and nothing but Arduin, or just playing long Arduin campaigns? Probably not. Which is unfortunate, but that's what the guys at Emperor's Choice, at least to what I can see, are moving. They're moving ahead with that. Like they're making that their priority is to make to bring Arduin back in a big way, and to make it a game that anybody can pick up and play. I think a lot of people now, especially people my age or kind of in my age range, they get those books and they use them for supplemental material. Like they like, hey, let me mine this for ideas, or let me grab this class and work it over into my game. So there's that. Now, how I use it, Arduin is like an idea landmine for me. Like I open up one of those books and boom, it explodes. I get all kinds of things. Like I'll go back to like where it's like listing the inns and taverns of Arduin, and I'm reading NPC names and events and location names and stuff, and my brain is just firing off. I'm making little notes. I'm like, oh, that would be a cool place, or hey, that reminds me of this. You know, it's just like again an idea creative landmine that just blows up in my head. I mean, those books are pure style. Like there's so much to love about those. There's the enthusiasm, the love of gaming, the love of the creativity. He gushes from the pages of those books, and that's what I love so much about it. So that's how I use it.
Gotcha.
And that's listen, and saying that like most people aren't using Arduin as it stands now as its own standalone game. That's not everybody, and that's not a dig at the system, not at all. I just think that's probably how most people are using it currently. Mm-hmm. Again, in what's coming, I've had a little glimpse at that. Like it looks good. Like I think we're gonna get a new age of Arduin coming. Like Shadow was saying in the chat, like 2024. I hope that is the big year for Arduin, because I'd love nothing more. You know, I would love it.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
I want to play Arduin. You know?
Yeah, absolutely. Now, and this, maybe this is too much of a softball or too much of a layup question, but based on your kind of reading of Arduin, would you say that it's fair to call David Hargrave one of the unsung heroes of role playing?
Unsung heroes. Unsung for sure. He's definitely a creative hero. Mm-hmm. You know, there is the plagiarism thing. And he had some questionable material in there over the year. It didn't bother me, but it definitely has bothered some folks. I mean, I just still laugh at the fact that he called, what was it? He said, all minotaurs are always horny. That's in the text, you know. You know, and there's Shardra the castrator. You know, she's got her breasts out and she's holding a giant axe, and I think it says something to the effect of like she kills all men and seduces all women, something like that. Mm-hmm. You know, there's some references that in there that are very distasteful, but again, you have to look at these books as at the time they were put out. Like this is 1977. The way things are now is very different from the way things are then. So that's it. When I think about it, it doesn't really bother me. Mm-hmm. I don't find that any of it really questionable. It's just others might. So you have to leave that door open for the interpretations from other folks. But again, I don't. I open those books and they're nothing but pure joy for me. So, so an unsung hero, yeah, he's definitely for me a creative hero. The one thing I wanted to do before I left California was to go to his grave and leave some dice on it and pay my respects, and I did. You know, like I had to meet the guys. Like, again, creative heroes, and definitely unsung. So the answer to that question is yes.
Awesome. Yeah, and there, like a lot of that stuff, I know like some people's sensibilities are offended by that stuff, but you also have to consider, like what we talked about last week, the influences on role playing as a whole and the kind of people who were into role playing at the time. I mean, that kind of stuff is not out of place with, you know, like Faster Pussycat Kill Kill Kill, or, you know, Ilsa She-Wolf of the SS. I mean, it's all kind of right within that, you know, grindhouse mindset that I think influenced a lot of gaming and definitely influences a lot of your gaming.
Sure. Absolutely. No, listen, if there's one influence, let me just full stop. If there is one influence on me as any of the stuff that I write or play or any stuff that I put out. It is Arduin.
Yeah.
Arduin captivated me more than anything else in gaming. And I owe Dave Hargrave and those 3 original little brown books an enormous debt of gratitude. So 1000% agree with you on that. And as far as you can't judge things that happened in 1977. And again, to take this with a grain of salt, but you can't judge a lot of things that happened in 77 with the same modern sensibilities that you have now. You just can't, because if you do, I got bad news for you about every song, all your favorite artists and songwriters and all the people who wrote the books that you love and the people who are on TV shows and movies. Like, you just can't apply that logic.
Yeah.
It's not the same. That's not saying people get a free pass or whatever, but trying to do that is just, it's not sensible. So,
yeah, absolutely. And then one thing, Shadow actually brought this up, and I completely forgot to mention it early on, but something we didn't talk about with David Hargrave was that he was not just influenced by the Vietnam War happening kind of proximate to him. He was there. He was a combat photographer.
Yep. Yeah, he was in the thick of it, But and that had, maybe that had something to do with his surly attitude. You have to kind of figure that out. Who knows? I didn't know the man. I can only glean from bits and pieces. But what a tough war to come back from. What a tough time to be a veteran in America, and especially in Berkeley.
Yeah.
That's tough, man. That's a tough ride. So if he was a little surly, if he was a little irritable, or if he had his own little demons that he was fighting with, and I say we give him a pass.
I mean, seeing the things that he saw definitely changes a man. Sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, just thinking of, like you said, seeing the things that he saw changing a man immediately made me think of the adventure scenario or the horror scenario that he wrote for Call of Cthulhu. Have you ever heard of this?
No, I haven't.
Maybe Shadow knows, but I don't remember the name of it. But man, it was rough. Like, it was not like any Call of Cthulhu scenario that had ever came out, man. It was like cringy in some parts, but like brutal. Like, it was just a rough, like, somebody will have to give that a little Google there. But I'm telling you, man, it was it goes down in history as like one of the roughest of the Call of Cthulhu modules for sure. And I think it may have been in a magazine, or maybe it was in a smaller publication or something. But tough. It was, when you go back and read it, it's like, whoo. And there's like a whole carnival theme going on in the book, and it's very, very rough.
Yeah.
So that's immediately what I thought of when you were saying that.
Also, I hate to burst everyone's bubble here in chat, but Levi is a Southern boy. He is not from California. I will not let you claim one of mine as one of yours.
No, I was raised. Well, I was born in Philadelphia, but raised in Arkansas. But I did live in California for several years. So, and quite liked it, actually. So, you don't get weather like that anywhere else in the United States.
Absolutely, absolutely. But you know what? Humidity builds character.
That's right. Or if you live in Boston, the cold will make you an interesting person.
Yep, absolutely. Gotcha. So I guess for now, that kind of brings us up to date on Arduin. Do you have any kind of final thoughts that you want to leave people with as far as Arduin goes?
Well, I can't believe we didn't talk about any of like the cool magic or the monsters or like any of like the craziness that went into it. Well, we did touch on the critical and fumble
Mhm.
charts a little bit. And the fact that it had, like, in the very first book when there were literally no rules on how to play, there was a whole subsection on prismatic walls and like 23 levels of hell or something. Like, it was just nuts to have in your first book. That's like seventh book kind of material. But if I had some final thoughts, listen, Arduin is, I think its strength again is in the just wild creative abandon that saturates this entire property.
Mhm.
Um, man, like the genuineness that comes through when you read it, the the fact that it's just jam packed with so much cool stuff, like little ideas, plot generators, and story hooks, and interesting names that will just make your brain fire off and think of, extrapolate off of these things. He writes it like Hargrave writes those first three books like, oh, you already know all this, so let me just kind of just throw all these. I just toss these names and ideas and things out like, oh,
Yep.
this is just stuff you should already know.
Mhm.
And it, instead of coming off as like making it even more disorganized, it strengthens it. It makes it even more interesting.
Mhm.
Um, yeah, he did something special with Arduin, and who was it? It was Jonathan Tweet, maybe. He said, God, what was it? I have it written down. Oh yeah, the coolest RPG book ever for complete Arduin. Um, and he's right. Like, those books are so cool. Like, back in the days when you had like whatever the 8 core classes were or whatever, you're just in the Advanced Dungeons and Dragons Player's Handbook,
Mhm.
and then he's throwing out stuff like witch hunters and saints and technos and
Mhm.
ninjas and traders, and he even had slavers and witch doctors and all kinds of odd stuff. And that you might be a, I don't know, 13th level fighter, but you've got a ray gun in one hand and a flaming sword in the other and a jetpack and along with your boots of speed. Like, it was like a
Nice.
really like no shits given. Like, we're here the fun is the most important thing. Yeah, Arduin was deadly, but man, like, anything went. You never knew like where a game might take you, and God forbid you should miss one, because who knows what was going to happen. Everybody might end up dead, or they might end up having cleared out a dragon's horde. You just never knew. Like, it's just the potential is unlimited with Arduin. It's a beautiful world it's deep and rich, and it's interesting, and the most important thing is it's cool. It's
Mhm.
so cool. And that's just the best, like, that's the best thing I can say about it. It is genuinely cool.
Gotcha. Yeah, I guess my takeaway here is that I need to get Arduin. I need to get a hold of one of the collections or something like that. So,
Well, they have, what is it? The complete Arduin. They have that reprinting of the three little books. There's Arduin, Bloody Arduin. You can find it. Like, you don't have to get the original three little books. You can find it reprinted elsewhere. And I believe they have the PDFs out too. So if you just want to taste, you can grab those. I'm not sure if they're on drive-through or not, but I'm sure you could definitely work something out with Emperor's Choice.
mhm.
So,
Well, yeah. If I tried to hunt down the originals, I remember you hunting down the originals, and from what I remember, it was quite pricey.
oh my God, it was awful. This is 20 years ago when I was trying to find this stuff, and they were still like, $80, $100. Now they're a couple $100 a piece, in some circles. Like,
Mhm.
curiously enough, I'm actually getting rid of my extra copies of the first two Arduin Dungeons on RPG auctions on Facebook now. I was shocked of the lack of Arduin stuff that has shown up on that site over the years.
Mhm.
When I go to cons, I'm always asking, "Got any Arduin?" Asking the vendors, "Got any Arduin?" Yeah, no, I don't have any. It's getting rarer and rarer. So,
Mhm.
if you're gonna put your hands on that stuff, now's the time to do it.
Yep. Yep. And Shadow, I've been meaning to have you on the show in the past, Shadow. So yeah, I mean, like, If you want to talk Arduin, I mean, Levi's probably your guy for that, as I'm just kind of dipping my toes into the Arduin pool there, but I definitely need to bring you on the
It
show.
sounds like Shadow and Son knows way more about Arduin than I do. Maybe you probably should have had him on instead. Again, there's a couple guys that I knew that knew way more, and I can't tell you who did what on the exact date of what, but when it comes to enthusiasm and the guts of Arduin, I think I'm a fairly good spokesman for that. Maybe a little too honest with it sometimes. I have my own feelings about it, but I like where it's headed.
Yeah.
I like the direction that it's headed. So
cool. Well, guys, that is going to do it for tonight's episode of Rollin Bones. Before we fully kind of finish up here, there's one more thing I want to remind everyone of, because this is still ongoing. You still have 2 weeks to jump on this. I appreciate you showing everyone my hoodie there, but we are shilling your stuff while we have you on the show here. And this is Chainsaw Wizards, Hectome Creeps, and Other Ungodly Bastards on Kickstarter right now. This is the current Planet X Kickstarter. Link is right there in chat.
it's a good one. It's
absolutely.
a good one.
Absolutely. It's chock full of insane Adrian Landeros art and
So good.
Wild creativity, as all Planet X products have within their pages.
Arduin inspired. My number one. That's my number one creative influence for sure.
Absolutely. All right, well, guys, just so you know, this is my go home show for North Texas. So I will not be doing an episode next week because I'll be prepping to head to Dallas. But we will be back in June with DM Blackwall. He will be my first guest in June. He will be on the first Tuesday in June. So no Rollin Bones next week, as I'm preparing to go to North Texas. I don't know if I'll have any content for you guys during North Texas, but I might try to do something. I don't know. We'll see how that goes. But we will be back in June with DM Blackwall and several other people. So until then, whether you rolled a 1 or a 20, I'm so glad that you rolled your bones with me, Ryan Howard, and I will see you all next time.
That was awesome.